create a VirtualBox image for imaging with Vagrant. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how you can build a VirtualBox virtual machine that's going to be fully prepared to use with Packer to build an image to be used with Vagrant. So come on, let's go through and create ourselves a brand new virtual machine. In the name of the virtual machine, it doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to put Ubuntu _24. We're building Ubuntu 24.04 _ server. We're building a server version, so command line only. We can move down to the ISO file, and I've already downloaded the server build ISO, and we want to skip the unattended installation. As we go through then and click next, I'm going to leave it at 2 gig of RAM, which is probably about right. We certainly don't want to put too much or too little resource in. The same thing as when we're looking at the CPUs. I don't want to assign more CPUs than perhaps somebody is going to have on their system if we are going to use this as a public Vagrant system. When I'm looking at the virtual disk, I've got 25 gigs assigned, and that's probably going to be about right as well. Remember, we want to make this a public Vagrant machine, so again, we don't want to take too many resources. We can go through then and review and finish. Before we start up our virtual machine, I'm going to make it easy so I can connect from my host machine to the virtual machine when we look at running the configuration. By default, it's going to be using the VirtualBox NAT network, and we have to then put port forwarding for us to be able to connect. So I'm going to move into Settings, move down to my network. Underneath NAT, I move to Advanced and Port Forwarding, and I can then go through and add a port forwarding rule in. And say the idea of this is to allow me to SSH into my machine using the port forwarding. So for my host IP address, I'm using 127.0.0.1. And I'm just using a random port here, 3333, so I know it's not going to be used by anything else. And then the guest IP I'm putting in is 10.0.2.15, which is the default address that will be used for your virtual machines, and port 22. We can remove this later before we look at imaging it, but it's going to help when we build our golden image. It's what we're concentrating on in this video. So with that done, we can go through and start our machine. Now, obviously, I can't connect to it remotely at this stage because, well, I haven't booted it up. But as I go through them, we can dive in and choose English. English and US is going to be good. Now then looking, I can choose the Ubuntu server, but I don't know exactly what's going to be installed, and I want as minimal as possible, and I can add in additional packages later. So I'm going to choose then the Ubuntu server minimized, and then we can choose done and continue through with our selection of our network card. And we can see there the 10.0.2.15 IP address where we put the port mapping in earlier. We don't need to connect through a proxy. For my LVM, we can go through and choose to use the whole disk as an LVM group. It shows me the layout, so I can choose done on this for the partitioning, and then I have to explicitly choose continue. I'm going to set up Vagrant as my full name. The server name, well, this is going to be Ubuntu 24.04, so I'm going to put Noble for the Noble Numbat. We do need to create a user called Vagrant and a password of Vagrant 2. If I want to make this a public system, then people have to know the credentials to use to connect to it. So commonly people use Vagrant with a password of Vagrant. We don't need Ubuntu Pro. We will definitely want the OpenSSH server, and we can click done. Now, there are a wealth of packages that I could add in here. It's interesting to see that they have included within this shortened list Microsoft PowerShell. So PowerShell 7 is now available for Linux. But we also have a lot of our cloud tools, such as the AWS, the Google Cloud. We have DigitalOcean tools being available here as well. But I'm just going to leave this blank and choose Done. And then we're now installing our system. We can allow the installation to run through, but once it has run through, we'll of course need to reboot. We can see this is now complete, so I can reboot my system. We'll just need to hit the Enter key to eject the CD-ROM, and we're running through the reboot procedure. And hopefully we'll get a good screen coming up without any issues. Once the boot is complete, I can return back to my SSH client and I can connect to port 3333 on the local host. Logging in, we can put then the Vagrant user with the password of Vagrant. Now we're ready to start configuring this image to make sure that it's going to be usable by both myself and other people who might need this image. So one of the first things that we're going to do is make sure that our apt cache is up to date. And as you can see, the Vagrant user has sudo privileges, but they have to put in a password. So we also need to be able to get rid of that. So I'm going to use the echo command now to create myself a sudo as configuration. And we can write through allowing the Vagrant user on all hosts that this file is placed on to sudo as the root account without having to use a password for all commands. I can echo this to the screen to make sure that it's working okay, but I can also pipe it through to visudo to check the configuration. So -C for check, -F for the file, but I'm just putting a dash in for the file so it reads from standard input. So we know then what we're writing is correct, and I'm happy now to use sudo and T to write to the configuration file, and we'll put it in the plugin directory, so etc sudoers.d and then Vagrant. So now that file is created, when I look at sudo -L, the Vagrant user doesn't have to put in a password for any of the commands so long as they're sudoing as root. So this is going to make life more convenient for both myself and anyone using the images. We can now go through and run our sudo and apt upgrade -y. And this is just going to make sure then that we've got the latest packages that are available. Now I can see that we are getting updates coming through, and they're including to the init RAM FF. So I'm going to reboot my system just to make sure that they're all referenced correctly. Now, of course, it's taken me back to my host machine. I can allow it a few seconds or so for it to reboot, but then I can SSH back in and we can continue with our configuration. So as we go back in, we are back in, up and running, and everything is looking hunky-dory. If I go through now and start putting in some of the applications that I will want, so I want Build Essentials, I want the dynamic kernel modules, the Linux headers for the current kernel, one of the reasons why I wanted the reboot. But we'll put in wget, curl, git, vim, bash completion, nano, and tree. Remember, this was a minimal installation. I certainly don't want too many packages, but I want things to be useful. The Build Essential and the dynamic kernel modules are going to be useful for us when we put it in our VirtualBox guest editions to make sure that things like our copy and paste will work. Things like our mapping of our host directory through to directories on our system. So even though we're not using a graphical environment, it's still going to be useful to have our VirtualBox guest editions. Once the installation then has completed, we can move on to the next step. And with this, I'm moving out to VirtualBox itself and telling it to install the Guest Editions CD-ROM, put the CD-ROM into the CD, and I can then move back to my SSH session. And inside of my SSH session, I can use sudo and mount /dev/CD-ROM, and we'll put it in the temporary working directory /MNT. And then I can run the installation script. So sudo mount vbox editions.run, and we can allow the process to run through. Then hopefully after a few minutes you're presented with this screen showing that everything has gone well. It tells me I might have to log out and log in again, but remember mine is an SSH session, so it's not really going to have much effect on my session, so I'm happy to continue. So clearing my screen, we can look at configuring the rest of our customizations, and there might be a few configuration files that we need to change. One of the things I don't like, because I use this often for creating videos, is on my tab completion, getting the bell sounding. So I can turn off the bell. So looking in the etc and input RC file, I'm just setting the bell style to be null. I can then save that. I also don't like the idea of the root user logging in via SSH, so I can configure the etc sshd_config file, and we can go through and look for our permit root login. And the default shows here where they're allowed to log in without a password, i.e. with a key. However, I'm just going to say permit root login, no. We can go through and save those changes. Now again, you might have other customizations that you want to put in. Customizations can still be done later using Packer, but this would be, if you like, my global settings that I would want from all images created from this golden image. We can make sure then that we've got no packages left over, so we can do our auto remove. So that's just going to make sure any removed packages, any of their dependencies are also removed. We can clear the package cache with apt clean, and we can remove any additional packages that are sitting in var, lib, apt, and lists, and just put asterisk in there. So again, just making sure that we're not having any extra files going across. Now we also need to make sure when the file is packaged up that it makes best use of space. And if we write zeros to all of the empty space, it makes for a much smaller compressed image. So I'm using sudo and dd, the input file being dev0, my output file writing to the root and empty file, and the block size of 1 meg. So we're just making sure then any empty space, because this will stop when the root file system starts filling up, so no space left in device. We can go through and remove this file now, but it just makes imaging better because we can create smaller archive files. Of course, I've got to use sudo to empty that or to remove the file. We're getting pretty close to the end now, but a few more things that we do need to make sure are done. We can go through and use sudo and find, and we can look in the var log directory, and we can truncate all of the log files. So we can go through and look for the type being a regular files, and executing the truncate command, truncating them to 0 bytes on the found file, and then making sure that we put in then the escaped semicolon. So that's emptied all of our logs For Vagrant SSH to work properly, we need to make sure that we download the public key for the Vagrant user. So we can download from HashiCorp and add it to the Vagrant user's authorized key file. We can use the private key then to authenticate to the system as Vagrant. We can make sure that our history is cleared, so we're not leaving any bash history behind. So history -C and history -W. And we're just about done now with our image. So we can do a sudo and power off, and we're ready to look at the next stage of building our image. But at the moment, we've got our golden image built and ready to go. Now let's just summarize what we've looked at. Now, of course, we had to install our minimal Ubuntu server. And once we had done the install, we configured port mapping within VirtualBox to allow us to log in via SSH. Having logged in via SSH, we can configure sudo privileges so the Vagrant user doesn't need to add a password when elevating privileges. We can then run our apt update and apt upgrade, rebooting just in case any of our kernel elements were updated. After this, we can then reconnect and install additional packages that we want. Normally we're going to need build essential, DKMS and our kernel headers. This is going to work well when we put our guest additions in. But we can install additional packages like git, curl, vim, nano, etc. With all of this done, we can then go ahead and install our guest additions. We might then need to customize files such as the etc input RC and our SSHD configuration. We need to make sure that we've got the public key for the Vagrant user added to the Vagrant user's home directory and .ssh authorized _keys. We can then go through and make sure that apt is kept tidy by going through doing an apt clean and deleting any of the additional files under var, lib, apt and lists. We can clear out all of our log files and truncate them. And finally, we can clear our history and shut down the system.
All that is left to say is thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, then you are probably sadder than I first thought. For more of this drivel, please subscribe, like and comment to @TheUrbanPenguin.